Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight in celebrating the work of Helen Mercer and Marion McAlpine, who've curated the PFI photo exhibit and booklet on display here tonight. Please pick up a booklet, and we're asking for a gold coin donation. Thank you. So Helen's organising bookings for the PFI exhibit. So if you have a space for a community event and you'd like to book the exhibit in the future, please talk to Helen. So tonight we'll be hearing from a man with a lot to say about PFI and the failures of outsourcing and privatisation. Dexter Whitfield of the European Services Strategy Unit. We'll also be hearing from Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell and Sarah-Jayne Clifton, Director of Jubilee Debt Campaign, on issues of PFI and PPP internationally. There'll be time for questions at the end. Firstly, a few words about the People vs PFI campaign. My name is Joel Benjamin, and I'm a founding member of the People vs PFI campaign, which launched in 2014. With the PFI conference attracting over 200 people from the NHS, local government, trade unions and housing campaigns, which has been working behind the scenes to raise issues such as poor building and fire safety in PFI housing and hospitals, and the failure of external auditors to monitor PFI governance failures and financial risk. PFI is a difficult issue to campaign on. It thrives on secrecy, is fiendishly complex, and wraps itself up in the cuddly language of public-private partnerships. Yet PFI is ultimately about banks taking over public money supply and unaccountable for-profit companies taking over public assets and the role of the state. PFI has been an issue which has stirred significant public anger. The very first PFI, Sky Bridge, depicted in the exhibit here tonight, resulted in the longest continuous protests in UK history. From the day the Sky Bridge opened in October 1995 until December 2004, when the Sky Bridge was bought out from Bank of America by the Scottish Executive and the tolls abolished, there were 600 arrests and 100 prosecutions over those 9 years. Police officers sent to make the arrests, and the Procurator Fiscal who charged the anti-toll protesters believed the PFI tolls were a fraud on the public and an abuse of government. We heard similar language recently from an unlikely quarter when Sir Howard Davies, the chairman of RBS, called PFI a fraud against the people. Over the last 4 years, there's been several significant moments which have shifted the public debate around PFI to the point where 68% of people polled by YouGov and Liverpool University now want PFI banned. Those events were the Scottish schools collapse at Oxgangs in Edinburgh, where masonry collapsed and, through a miracle, did not injure children in the process, resulting in the closure of 17 PFI schools across the Scottish capital. There, of course, was a Grenfell Tower fire and an awakening of the risks of outsourced construction and self-certification. There was, of course, a Labour conference pledged to end PFI and nationalise PFI special purpose vehicles. And we've also recently seen PFI tree felling in Sheffield, which has enraged an entire community and discredited the council. Finally, Carillion's collapse earlier this year has exposed the criminal recklessness, greed and inherent instability of the entire PFI sector, exposing auditors such as KPMG, who are supposed to keep watch over them. In 2018, with the PFI industry finding itself discredited, and most PFI providers like Interserve, Meaty and Capita under close watch for signs of further collapse, questions naturally turn to what to do about existing PFIs and what comes next. I'd now like to hand over to our speakers, beginning with Dexter Whitfield. Thank you.
Okay, I'll stay seated if that's all right. Well, firstly, I think the exhibition and the leaflet are brilliant. They're fantastic. I want to start by saying that. I think that they are fantastic and they're really important because they put PFI into context. It's about schools, it's about hospitals, it's about public housing, it's about prisons, and so on. It puts it in that kind of context people can identify with. The second thing I think is important, that it puts it in the both the exhibition and the pamphlet put it in the context of financialisation, marketisation and privatisation. And that, in a sense, roots it in neoliberal ideology, which is where it came from, and we have to keep on reminding ourselves where it came from and what it actually means in that broader context. And the other issue, I think, advantage to it is that it's got an international perspective, and which is currently vital in the sense of the G20 and World Bank attempts to have a global-wide promotion of PPPs. So I think from those three issues, the exhibition is vital. I want to start by looking ahead a bit. I'm jumping. Some people say I'm jumping the gun, but I think we can look at it in 4 phases. We're currently in a phase of looking at the sort of planning and developing strategies. What do we do about nationalisation? How can nationalisation be achieved and at what cost? And how can it, in a sense, determine the end of PFI? Because that has to be the basic objective. It is the end of PFI. It's not windfall taxes, it's not a bit of nationalisation of the debt or whatever. It has to be about how we eliminate this model that we have before us. So it is about, there's work to be done around that issue, and work is being done about that. Secondly, we have to get PFI nationalisation within Labour's programme, in the manifesto, and in Labour's programme for government, assuming that it is going to be elected with a large majority, that we can actually put this into reality. And yes, I'm making an assumption, and it's but that is really important. We have to have that in order to, in a sense, get rid of it. The third element is winning the legislative battle that will materialise once Labour says we're going to develop legislation, and there will be a battle because the private sector is going to retaliate in all kinds of ways. Some of us remember 1997 when Labour came into power and there was the Bates Review. The Bates Review was to look about what should Labour do about PFI. But Bates Review turned into how fast do we accelerate it, and what legislation do we need to guarantee all those unitary payments to the private sector. So I'm only saying that in the sense that we have to be absolutely firm on our ground, and we have to be firm in our commitment to do the final deed. And the other sub-stage is about how, once we have legislation, how is that implemented? How do we, in a sense, put that legislation into effect to achieve the nationalisation that we've set out? And that itself won't be easy, and it won't be easy if we just accept that the public sector is the public sector in terms of its current capabilities and capacity to do various things. And if all this happens in 3, 4, 5 years' time, then that capacity and capability will be even less now. So my point is that we can't just assume that this is all just going to happen and the private sector is going to be there to actually do it, because it won't work, in my view. So, on that basis, what we have to do as well is to talk about the implications of that legislation, which is really about radical change in public management. We need radical change in terms of the way services are governed. We need a radical new model about how the planning and design and construction of new infrastructure takes place. We're going to scrap PFI, that how do we, in a sense, radicalise a different system about how do we get new forms of procurement, and how we get new forms of different types of infrastructure. And in my view, linked to that is that there has to be a priority about reinventing and re-establishing forms of public ownership. And that should have a priority over the establishment of cooperatives where there's been a lot of talk and discussion. I'm not against cooperatives, but, and they have certainly a key role, but the prime role has got to be to, in a sense, rebuild the capacity and capability of the public sector. Otherwise, we'll end up with a whole fractured system, and the public sector will be even on a worse footing and a worse levels of ability than it currently has. So I want to now turn the clock forward a bit, or turn it back to where we are now, to the present. The PFI brand is severely damaged, and I think there won't be any disagreement about that. And if you go on the streets and in the markets and you ask people about PFI, you get basically 90, I would say, and I've always used this phrase, this is where we had an office in Sheffield. We always said, if you go to Barnsley Market and ask them about PFI, well, 95% will tell you it's crap and we've got to get rid of it. Slight exaggeration, maybe, but if you go and you talk to people about PFI, there is that. But we cannot take that for granted, as much as we want to, and that is embedded in people's minds. We cannot rely on what we know, and we can't, in a sense, believe what the public understand and what they want in the future. In other words, what I'm saying is, we know a lot now about PFI, but we can't just rely on that to say, well, that's going to change, and we need to, in a sense, develop all that knowledge and intelligence. Which comes back to the exhibition, and I think it has a critical role in a sense, trying to shape those 4 different stages. In a sense, the message is going to be taken to CLPs, trade unions, tenants associations, community organisations, and into schools and hospitals and public libraries, where they still exist, of course. And okay, that will be difficult because a lot of schools will say, you're not having it here, and NHS Trust will say, you're not having it in here because it's too biased or whatever. But we have to take the message out in a much more systematic way. I think trade unions must take a key role in all of this in terms of supporting, helping to organise and financing, even as financing more pamphlets, or more versions of the exhibition to get out and around. So I don't want to say very much more, except to say that the exhibition is a very real asset, unlike PFI. This is a very real asset that is here, and I think we have to, in a sense, ensure that it reaches the widest possible market, I said market there, the widest possible audience, the widest possible audience, because it has a role to play in this future agenda. I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you, Dexter. Now handing over to John McDonnell.
Okay. Let me start with this. If it wasn't for me, you would now all be sitting under about 3 foot of water. I use that explanation because years ago in the early 80s, I'm part of the archaeology of this. In the early 80s, I was the chair of finance on the GLC, so I was Chancellor of the Exchequer for London, basically. And I had the ability to have a relationship with the City of London in which I could borrow on the strength of London, so I borrowed at a rate much lower than anyone else could borrow. I had the ability to cover the costs of that borrowing by issuing a precept, which was completely uncontrolled by central government. And also I could charge business rates as well. And I used those resources to bring them all together, to borrow the money, to have the precept at actually a reasonable level that could cover the cost of that borrowing, to build the Thames Barrier. And the Thames Barrier was built on time it was publicly owned, on time, and basically it saved London from flooding for the last 30 odd years. That project over the last 20 years would most probably have been a PFI, would have been most probably 3 times more expensive, most probably wouldn't have arrived on time, and I have a sneaking suspicion wouldn't have worked either. That's whatever happened between 1986, when the GLC was abolished, and, well, up until, well, now, really. Well, what happened was, as you know, Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister in '79. You had this bizarre experiment for the last 30-odd years with neoliberal policies, which included widespread privatisation, undermining of trade union rights, the demolition of the welfare state as far as they could, and the maximisation of profits. And the maximisation of profits by opening up areas for profit taking that were up until then sacrosanct, and that was largely the welfare state areas. And you had effectively about 150 major companies touring the globe looking for profits. And along came Mrs. Thatcher and said, well, we can open up the welfare state to enable this to happen, and we can open up central state as well. And that's what happened. And I can remember I was elected in '97, and Jeremy and I remember the day we went to a Unison parliamentary group meeting. We're both Unison members. And we went to our parliamentary group meeting, and Alan Milburn, whatever happened to him, he came along and gave us a briefing, because he then became Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He gave us a briefing on the virtues of PFI. And PPBs and all the other schemes that were coming forward. And the argument that they were put then was that, one, this would keep, well, at that point in time, accountants, they would keep this money off the books, it wouldn't be taken into account as part of the overall debt, etc. Then secondly, it would be more efficient. And thirdly, it would transfer risk to the private sector. Now, I remember the meeting. Jeremy and I sat next to, well, we had to for protection. We sat next to each other. We sat next to each other and said, this is never going to work, because you're introducing into schemes that up until now we could actually borrow very cheaply for. We could cover the cost as a result of overall taxation. You're introducing a profit motive, which will mean we will be shelling out to shareholders large amounts of money. And actually, we would most probably, almost certainly, in most of these ventures, lose control of the operation or the construction, etc. Needless to say, Jeremy and I were not necessarily in the majority at that point in time. Although, actually, I think we were in the majority in terms of expressing scepticism, but not in the majority in terms of winning the argument. And so then the invention that was under John Major then got rolled out on a scale under New Labour that was extraordinary. And some of them were bizarre. Look on London Underground, you know, the PPB collapsed there. And the National Audit Office report said there was a saving of £476 million by bringing it in-house. To give Gordon Brown his due, when they said I'd been appointed Shadow Chancellor, he actually said, well, he's always been Shadow Chancellor, really. Because I used to produce alternative budgets to Gordon every year on a very amicable way. But I also used to challenge him on some of the policies. And the most bizarre one was the PFI in terms of selling off the tax offices from around the country. And it was bizarre because we sold them off to a company in a tax haven. And it went on. It went on and went on. So when Jeremy got elected leader, we said we would look at the whole issue about how we democratically control our economy at every level, both nationally, regionally and locally, and also have democratic control of the individual companies as well. And how could we translate that into real action? And one of the issues that came up time and time again is that if we are going to have some form of enhanced democratic control of our economy, we have to address the issue of privatisation, and PFI is included within that. And the issue around PFI was it failed to achieve even any of the targets that they set themselves, you know. It wasn't taken off the books in accountancy terms. It did not transfer the risk because, you know, they talk about moral hazard with the banks. There's a moral hazard in these PFIs because we always bail them out. Whenever they go bust, we have to because they're essential public service usually. And then you looked at the delivery of most of them in terms of efficiency of delivery. As what the National Audit Office says, there's no evidence whatsoever to demonstrate the private delivery of these services is more effective and more efficient than the public service delivery as well. So all the justifications for PFIs were undermined by the experience of them. But then on top of that, we started looking at the finances of it. And we just give the example of the NHS PFIs that have taken place. the profits, I think the profits, Rory McQueen is here who's doing the report, and I'm grateful for Dexter for all the advice and support he's given us. It's been fantastic to us. But the profits on the NHS PFIs the last 7 years is about £830 million. Well, can you imagine that amount of money we could plough back into the NHS? And then also we were looking at the profit rates of PFI shares being sold on. Something like 30% of the profit rates that were taking place. And then we were looking at where was this money. It's always best to trace the money, and the money was largely going into tax havens as well. So I just think that we've gone through a whole period of almost irrationality in terms of, I have a reputation of being a bureaucrat within the Labour Party, and I am, and I'm proud of it. You look at just as a bureaucrat objectively, this was an absolute disaster in policy-making terms by anyone who comes and looks at it. But if you were a shareholder, or if you were one of the companies that was speculating on these schemes, it was a bonanza. It was a bonanza for you. And I think that what Dexter said, increasingly now, as Doncaster Market or whatever, increasingly people are saying we've been ripped off by this, so what do we do about it? So we said at last year's Labour Party conference, basically what we'll do, we'll bring the PFIs back in-house. And the way that we said we'd do that is on the advice of Dexter and others, and I'm grateful for the work that's been done by people who've been advising us. The special purpose vehicles are 10% equity. We bring them back into public ownership. We'll swap, if necessary, swap we'll swap bonds for shares in the normal way that you do any private nationalisation we have in the past. And then we get to the situation where we start renegotiating the debt, because the burden of these PFIs is in the debt, where it's the debt and the charges and the costs, etc., where people, I think, have fleeced the public sector, fleeced taxpayers, and made a fortune out of it. There's 200 billion commitment now between now and the next 25 years that we're loaded with already. We think by bringing them into public ownership, we can then start looking at the debt issues and make it much more effective than that. It's interesting, the exposure on the PFIs now is not just us. The National Audit Office report of a few weeks ago, used examples, 70% profit rate in building a hospital, 40% on some school groups that had gone ahead as well. And interesting today, the Court of Auditors of the European Union came out with a report today critical of the whole process of PFI, basically because it's waste and inefficiency that's taken place. And the advice for the future is not to go near them, basically. So we're now in a position where we've taken a policy decision that will bring them back. Step by step, we nationalise the special purpose vehicles, we renegotiate the debt burden that there is there, and then we transfer the responsibility for those PFIs to their natural home, which is the public service provider, whether it's NHS, schools, or whatever. Dexter's made a really important point, though. The worry that we've got is because of the way in which they've broken down and eliminated whole sections of the local, regional and national state, there is a real resource issue here, because you've lost some expert staff that could administer these schemes, you've lost the historical knowledge that's been built up over generations, etc. So one of the issues that we've got to address is how do we restore that? Just so you know then where we're at the moment. The manifesto that we had for the last election was the manifesto for the last election, and now we're looking at it to see how we radicalise it, but how that becomes the basis of the foundations for the next manifesto. For each policy in that manifesto, and for each policy that's been announced subsequently, like the PFI scheme at last Labour Party conference, we're looking to develop, and this is where Dexter and other advisors come in, almost the implementation manual for the implementation of that policy, and that getting the drafting of the legislation on the shelf, so that when we go into government we hit the deck running on all of these particular issues. And the reason that this issue is so important for us is a combination of things. One is that at the moment we have particularly local councils, and it's interesting, it is Conservative local councils that are going bust at the moment. We have a number of local councils and we have a number of hospital trusts that are being brought down by these PFI commitments. So therefore there's a sense of urgency about having to deal with them. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that we want to put in place the new model of how we go forward as well. And again, we'll be consulting people around that and around issues around public ownership, the new models that are being developed around how do we ensure that there's representation on any boards or management boards or structures of both the workers themselves, the expert management, the local representatives and the consumers, or when it comes to rail passengers. And we need to make sure that we develop those models on each aspect of public ownership that we're going to restore in this country. I suppose finally there's two things. One is we've got to get across now, we've got to move people from a sense of outrage about being ripped off into one that is actually saying, right, we consolidate their support for moving on to the policy that we're advocating. I think that's where we're at. The second issue then is how do we do that? And I think that's where Helen and Marion have done such a great job. When you look at each one of these individual screens, it tells an individual story that people can relate to about a very practical way in which PFI has been used and actually has been used against us. And when people see the individual examples, it then leads them to question the whole existence of PFI and its whole future, and then look for the alternatives. And what this exhibition is, and the booklet is just tremendous, really. Both the combination of that, I think, is popularising the issue, but also, more importantly, is explaining to people how we can dig ourselves out of this mess. Finally, I think also it's one of those small areas which multiplies into so many other areas where we're undermining and defeating neoliberal ideology and offering people an alternative. Now, that alternative, I think, is one which opens up the debate, which I'm interested in, is about what a socialist Britain would look like as well. Thanks a lot, Joe.
Thank you, John. And now Sarah-Jayne Clifton from Jubilee Debt Campaign.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks very much, Charles, and the opportunity to speak. This is a really important exhibition, and big congratulations to Helen and the other people who made it happen. It shows really clearly, and obviously Dexter and John have talked about the rip-off nature of PFI, or PPPs, public-private partnerships, as they're known internationally, and asked the really important question, why and how is it that we're still paying for it? Helen's fantastic booklet goes through the key problems with PFI, and obviously they're really widely known now. Obviously the first one being that the cost to governments is a lot more than if the infrastructural services were publicly funded. PFI has led to large windfall gains for private companies involved at public expense. It's enabled tax avoidance through offshore ownership. It's led to declining service standards and staffing levels, particularly in NHS hospitals. It's hollowed out our state capacity to design and build and run public infrastructure, and it's eroded democratic accountability over public services. I want to address two aspects of the PFI issue, which I think we need to tackle head-on if we're going to finally end this rip-off and stop it also from doing so much damage around the world. First of all, the widespread myths and falsehoods that have been used to justify PFI, which are still being repeated despite many people knowing how much of a scam it is now. And secondly, the fact that despite having been widely discredited here in the UK, our government is still promoting it as a model for funding public services and infrastructure around the world, and also pushing the World Bank, which we have a really big say in, to do the same. So just to start with the myths, the most important one has already been mentioned by John. For us, we think the biggest and most destructive myth, which we obviously heard from the Thatcher and Blair governments, when they began to roll out PFI, but we're hearing now in relation to the financing of the global sustainable development goals, is that there isn't enough money. This argument goes that the sheer size of the infrastructure gap, our need for schools and hospitals, means that governments have got no choice but to bring the private sector in to finance development. And underlying this is a notion that with PFI, private sector money is generously paying for public services, not the taxpayer, which of course we know is completely false. In both PFI and direct funding of government infrastructure and public services, it's the taxpayer who pays. It's just that with PFI, the taxpayer gets ripped off in multiple ways. Because the borrowing costs of the private sector are higher than if the government were to borrow directly, because the private sector is siphoning off money for profit, and also because many of the projects go bust and then the public sector has to pick up the pieces. So we need to take down this myth that there isn't enough money. And there are, of course, lots of ways to generate more government revenue. Corporation tax is at a record low. We have the lowest tax rate, the third lowest tax rate of any G7 country. There's a lot of scope for a more progressive and redistributive tax system which can bring in more government revenue to fund public services. Then there's money creation. The government found £400 billion of QE to help prop up the economy after the financial crash. The Bank of England itself has said that 40% of that went to the 5% richest households, but there's obviously potential for money creation again if we need it to invest in infrastructure. But there's also a really strong long-term financial case for government borrowing to invest in infrastructure. The average interest rate that the special purpose vehicles pay for their borrowed money for PFI is around 8%, whereas the government can borrow for 30 years at 3.5%. That's already a really, really big saving. Then, of course, there's the myth that the private sector delivers services more cheaply and more efficiently than the public sector. Obviously, for decades, the railways have shown this isn't true. And now, with Carillion and Capita, it couldn't be more clear to us that left to their own devices, private companies will extract every cent they can from public services, paying massive salaries to chief executives, massive dividends to shareholders, loading the projects up with lots and lots of debt, exploiting and laying off workers, cutting back on services, getting dodgy accountancy firms to sign off the books, and then walking away scot-free when leaving the workers in the small businesses and the public sector to clear up the mess. So PFI is essentially a cash cow for a parasitic private sector seeking to maximise returns on investment. And it's a mechanism which allows the extraction of taxpayers' money for profit, diverting it away from public services and infrastructure. The problems with PFI are widely documented by the National Auditor's Office, the Treasury Select Committee, and the European Court of Auditors. But despite this growing evidence base and actually the downgrading of PFI policy here in the UK, so now there are kind of 10 projects a year or something compared to 60 new projects a year in 2007, despite this, PFI is still a major global export. There's various government ministers who have vocally criticised PFI here in the UK, but their departments are still presiding over its promotion to some of the poorest countries in the world. I'll read you some of these quotes. Jeremy Hunt, Secretary of State for Health, he said in 2015, "One of my biggest concerns is that many of the hospitals now facing huge deficits are seeing their situation made infinitely worse by PFI debt." Then we have Liam Fox, Secretary of State for International Development. He said, "We all know from reports that have gone to Parliament the cost that PFI has ultimately given the taxpayer." And Boris Johnson, speaking when he was Mayor of London, "In other countries this would be called looting, here it's called a PPP." Yet in spite of this, their departments are promoting PPPs overseas, and the FCO and Department of Health are actually using development aid money in order to do this. And Department of Health and Department of Trade have set up something called Healthcare UK, which is specifically geared towards promoting health PPPs around the world. One of their showcase schemes is St Bart's Hospital, which, despite the government having paid 6 times more than the original private sector investment, and obviously having serious failings, leading to the largest financial deficit of any health trust in the country, is being presented as a showcase scheme for countries around the world to follow. Healthcare UK, I'll just read you one more quote. Healthcare UK says, "The UK is a world-leading innovator in project financing, particularly through its pioneering approach to public-private partnerships. These partnerships harness the best in public and private sector skills for the cost-effective provision of modern, high-quality public services. You can work with UK organisations to develop your own models of PPPs, assured by our track record of delivering successful programmes for acute, primary, community and mental health facilities. So, just to finish off, in our view at Jubilee Debt Campaign, the government's promotion of these rip-off schemes to some of the poorest countries in the world is totally hypocritical, and it's clearly driven by the interests of UK finance and multinationals rather than out of any concern for increasing access to public services in developing countries. Of the 23 developing countries that have active, proposed or stalled PPPs, the UK government has been promoting PPPs through workshops and training of government officials in 18 of them. There's a map in our report which I've put at the back which shows some of these countries. This includes countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, whose healthcare schemes are still recovering from the devastation of Ebola. Some really poor countries like Lesotho, where one World Bank supported PPP for a single hospital and its filter clinics was using up half of the country's healthcare budget. Fortunately, there's growing resistance and awareness about the PPP model from global civil society, driven very much by the global unions, by Public Services International, whose national members are really at the forefront of the fight against PPPs in their country. But the fingerprints of UK companies, legal firms, investors are all over many of the projects. For example, in Uganda and Kenya, teaching unions are taking legal action against the rollout of low-cost, substandard private schools run by UK-based Bridge International Academies. That's just one example of the UK involvement. But in other countries, the campaigns are further along, and actually there's some really good examples of campaigns, of projects, PFI projects and privatisation projects being brought back in-house. It's really exciting. There's a Public Services International website which documents basically this taking back in of really essential public services. And at the World Bank and IMF annual meetings in October, 52 global trade unions and civil society organisations from 45 different countries submitted a manifesto sounding the alarm on PPPs and calling on the World Bank and IMF and countries like the UK to stop promoting them. So the fight is on. And that's why we as Jubilee Debt Campaign really welcome the commitment from Labour to end PFI here in the UK and bring projects back in-house. We think that's absolutely essential. We also really welcome the commitment last September to end the promotion of this dangerous model overseas. This is a really important and welcome commitment, but of course, as a campaigning organisation, we would like to see a future Labour government go further and seek to actually undo the damage that has been done through this shameless and irresponsible and self-interested promotion of PPPs. And we would really like to see the UK under a Labour government position itself as a global champion of a strong, publicly funded and democratically accountable public sector around the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Just to build on that comment before we move into questions, I think one of the policies from the Labour side which has really excited me in recent months has been the calls for a national investment bank. So there was some work done on this by the New Economics Foundation, and author I think was Laurie McFarlane, who looked at this particular case study in Scotland, where Scotland has spent £40 billion on PFI over the last 30 years. If the infrastructure had been funded by a national investment bank instead of PFI, the saving in interest costs alone would have been £25 billion. If you take that for the whole of the UK, which is about £310 of PFI infrastructure spend, the saving is around £200 billion in added interest costs. So the savings here by moving to a publicly funded national investment bank model are absolutely enormous. So if we can open up for questions, I'll pass the microphone around if anyone would like to put their hand up and ask a question for the panel.
Yeah, Andy Walker from Infrastructure Intelligence magazine. That's my day job. but I'm very sympathetic to the points being made from the platform, and I've got a couple of sort of questions and just one very brief point to make. It's interesting that Carillion's being mentioned, because in my day job I had to obviously report on the Carillion situation, and it's really interesting when you start looking at who owns the hospital companies that are building all the hospitals, because you don't have to dig far to find out that most of them are headquartered in, you know, Andorra and God knows where else. And if, you know, the thing that came to my mind was, there's been a lot of talk recently about taking back control. And, you know, so I'll just leave that there. But I was interested in what Dexter said in relation to procurement and how we work with the construction industry, because contrary to popular belief, most of the firms in the construction industry are smaller firms and they're not making a fortune out of PFI. And if you actually look at what happened with Carillion, you know, a lot of the small construction firms basically didn't get paid. And so how will you frame the strategy going forward in relation to working with private construction firms? Because you will have to work with private construction firms going forward. I don't think there's going to be a wholesale return to DLOs across the board. So how will you get that across? Because I actually think there's an open door and an opportunity for Labour at the moment to actually win support from construction firms, the majority of whom do not have an investment stake in PFI. They're just delivering the project. And I think, because a lot of the stuff that gets put out in the media is, oh, you're trying to just, you know, basically, you know, get rid of private firms, which I know you're not. And I think that message needs to come out a bit better. Sorry, I waffled a bit there.
Should we take the questions in batches of 3? I think there was another question down the front here, the gentleman with the blue shirt.
Yeah, my concern is about mainly the NHS. You mentioned, John, the service providers. Now, you're probably aware that a large proportion of the provision is now being done by private providers, sometimes within apparent NHS facilities and NHS badged. I think it's absolutely crucial that with the nationalisation, that we don't talk about publicly managed, we don't talk about publicly run, we talk about publicly provided by directly employed labour. And further to what the gentleman at the back said, I do agree that these small companies have been ripped off by late payments. They've gone under because the Carillion type operations haven't paid on time. It's another way of extracting undue profit. But I think we really should move towards a situation of direct labour. The other aspect of what I wanted to ask about is the question of who owns the premises that have been built under PFI, because I've heard that the deeds have been handed over to, for example, academy chains, who, as far as I can see, could decide in a few years' time, we're not making any money out of running schools, we'll turn it into flats. And then there won't be any land to replace the schools, as is the case with the hospitals, where the land is proposed to be forcibly taken away from us and given over to property developers. So I'd like to have some comment on in which direction Labour policy is going to go on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Frances Hook. I'm a Greenwich Keep NHS Public, and we've got probably one of the worst PFI hospitals. There's another issue with the PFI. It was connected to the dismantling of the NHS from the late 80s, because every time a PFI hospital is built, they reduce the bed by 25 to 30%. And in our area, the public were obviously more intelligent than our MP Nick Wainsford. Because they were working with us against it, and then 3 months before the 97 election, he was in my sitting room and said, it's a good deal, it's only going to be 25 million, etc. But I think you must look at the NHS, I don't know about education, to do with the privatisation and dismantling of the NHS. Also, in our PFI, the Labour Council with the one MP and the campaigners are looking at taking the soft services and its ISS part of Unilever to try and get in-house contract. We think that's the road we're going down, because we feel if we go for the buyout, which was said at a public meeting we held recently, then it'll be far too expensive. It's better to take it as the contracts come up. The other issue is about what Jennifer said at the front. The Labour Party nationally has to start fighting back on stopping the nailer sale-off, because the selling off all sorts of land of the hospitals and the primary care, and once that's gone, we'll have problems of knowing what we need for the community. There's no plans.
Thank you. So I think the first question was for Dexter, so I'll just sort of pass over. And that was about Carillion taking back control in small business.
I think that's a really important question, because I think it is dangerous also to smear the whole construction industry in terms of Carillion. And I think and it's one of the things that I'm looking at, in the sense of trying to look at both existing DLOs in the public sector, where you have got good examples in City Build in Glasgow, which has got 2,000 workforce, still building, still repairing, etc., although it has now gone a joint venture deal with a big local housing association. But you've got examples like that, which have got obviously significant potential to have a major role. In other cities like Sheffield and others, the DLO was in a sense flogged off in a JVC to Kier and a lot of other companies. So you've got this sort of fragmented DLOs in a way on the one side, but with some potential. And then you've got the private sector, where I agree with you. There are firms who are being involved. There are firms who have been involved in lift projects, but haven't become involved in PFI, and have been involved in lift projects which are, in a sense, building the primary care infrastructure, and at a much more local level, etc. And are not, in a sense, in the same categories of rip-off merchants of like Carillion. I mean, Carillion went into PFI on a massive scale, and there's a spreadsheet on our website that showed how they made £500 million by selling PFI shareholdings in the projects that they were involved in. So for them, it was big time, big money, etc. So I think what we have to do, and what I'm trying to do, is to, in a sense, build a clearer picture of what is happening in the public sector, where the public sector is, and also what's happening in the private sector on the same basis that you suggested, to try and actually see where there's a path forward, and where maybe there's joint ventures, maybe there's new types of DLOs, etc. And I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind is that we can't just, in a sense, return to the old DLO. And I think that is that model is, in a sense, to use consultant jargon, is not fit for purpose. I mean that in a different way from what they talked about, but in a way which we have to put DLOs in a different framework and a different context.
Thank you. And John, do you want to come in on the second question about public provision, the NHS, and direct labour?
Just on the first question, you mentioned about your research into where a number of these companies were, like Andorra and elsewhere. Alongside the manifesto, I published the Grey Book, which was basically a budgetary exercise linked to the manifesto. And included in that, and it's interesting, we've used it over the last week with regards to Russian oligarchs, we included in that an overseas company's property levy. So that if there's an overseas company owning or purchasing property in this country, and they were based in the blacklisted HMRC tax havens, we would apply a levy to them, 15% on top of existing stamp duties, etc. That would have brought us in a significant sum that we could then have used to investment in our public services. The IFS challenged that. It was one of the few things in our budget that they challenged. And we suggested that, and they said it wouldn't operate, it wouldn't work. And we said, well, actually, if you went to Singapore, Hong Kong, Toronto, Canada, etc., they operate those levies there, and they're very successful, and they bring in a fair amount of income to fund their public services. That's one of the things we're developing now in more detail to make sure it's fully operational when we go into government. And it's interesting, as I say, it came up in the discussion around housing in the capital city because of the purchase of properties by, and it was something like a quarter of that was by Russian oligarchs, and a lot of those standing empty as a result. Just as you mentioned infrastructure, the whole point of us going into government is to rebuild our country at every level, and that will be largely about infrastructure as well. So it's road, rail, digital, you name it, and it's rebuilding our physical infrastructure as well as our social capital infrastructure as well. And the way we'll do that is via public procurement at every level, using every structure. So one of the issues for us now is how do we shape that public procurement to have its maximum effect? And this will work on different levels. We've been working with Preston Council for the last couple of years, and Matthew Brown, and they've developed the collaborative council model based upon experiments in the US. And what they've done is they've got together all the local anchor institutions, the council, the NHS, the local university, the police, combined their procurement, and they've repatriated investment from beyond their county borders and elsewhere back into their city and into their county. And the way that they've done that is straightforward, contracting out, yes, to small firms in particular, but also they've encouraged alternative models of ownership like cooperatives, etc. And that's a model that we've now seeking to develop. Well, other councils are now beginning to develop it. And we've put together the idea that we'll have a common unit that will provide expertise and support to our councils as they develop those policies. That will involve as well those local authorities or NHS or trusts, etc., who do want to rebuild some element of a DLO, because you can see there's room for that as well. But as Dexter said, most probably not on the old DLO model. In some ways, it's almost replicating the cooperative model within that institution as well. So the workforce have better representation and control over their work experience and the remuneration as well that they get. So those experiments will go on now, and they'll be going to government itself. At the national level, obviously what we're looking at now is a capital transformation fund of £250 billion worth of investment over 10 years. The National Investment Bank matching that with another £250 billion. So it's £500 billion over a 10-year programme. To be frank, nothing untoward or revolutionary in comparison with levels of investment under past Labour governments. But that will all be done via processes of procurement that will enable us, I think, not just to procure effectively, but also to raise standards around the nature of employment, the levels of remuneration, the delivery of the service, the accountability of that service to local communities as well. Key to that, obviously, and if we take the NHS example, the key to that is our desire to end all privatisation within the NHS and to bring services back into the NHS for direct delivery. But at the same time, this issue around schools and National Health Service trusts is to seek to end the sell-off of property that's been taking place on such a massive scale. And the reason that's been happening, and the reason people entered into PFIs, because at that point in time there was no other show in town. And so I felt for some of the decision makers in these instances who've gone into these schemes because there was no alternative, and they were told there was no alternative. In my constituency, in '97, we'd been occupying a school for 6 months that the Tory council had closed, with the hope of a Labour government coming in. The Labour government came in. We had a brand new school. I opened it, but they were forced to have a PFI because they were told they wouldn't get the money if they didn't have the PFI. Now again, that's why some of those decisions were made, and it's borders on the irrational, to be honest. That will never happen under the next Labour government, and aspects of ownership are going to be key to all the decisions that we make, because ownership means control, and control means the opportunity of democratic control.
So I think we had a question from Brian in the front here, and then someone in the middle.
I want to start with snow. I know it sounds funny, but in Kent we have 14 PFIs, Kent County Council, and 11 of them are for schools, and 3 of them are for plant and machinery. And within the contracts that they have, they get penalised if the snow ploughs and the gritters go out after a set date within the contract. So when they went out just recently, I think it was over the weekend it snowed in Kent, they were fined. And so this pushes up the price that they have to then pay at the other end. So what's been happening in Kent, where it's been snowing each year, well, it didn't snow for the last 4 years, really effectively for them to send out the gritters and the ploughs. And then last year it snowed quite heavily, and then we saw a massive increase in PFI costs. And it was all plant and machinery. So we've talked about the NHS, great, yeah, but people go to hospital because their cars crash on roads which aren't cleared by machinery or because they get fined. So this then led us to make an objection to Kent County Council's accounts. Now, obviously, Kent have an auditor, and this was a point that Joel made in his opening remarks. Now, an auditor is not going to bite the hand that feeds it, i.e. KPMG with Carillion or Grant Thornton in Kent. So the legislation, and this question is to Mr McDonnell, we're going to need legislation that's going to correct this. We're going to need it because obviously we need the roads to be clear so we don't send people to hospitals, you know, because of car crashes, and also to correct auditors and make them actually look at the things that need looking at.
Thank you, Chair. I'm John Bailey from City and Hackney CCG. At a recent public meeting, I asked how the proton therapy unit at UCH was going to be funded. It's £23 million, and I asked specifically whether it was a PFI scheme. I was told no. Now, does John know of any other show in town by which that could be funded? It must be, in some other respects, either public money that's going to the large hospitals in London, Barts included, and presumably to other hospitals outside of London, which aren't funded in the same way. Any answers on that, please?
Purple shirt.
Hi, John Burgess from Barney Unison Easy Council. We've had a lot of dealings with the likes of Capita and outsourcing. Forgive me if I seem a bit tired. I'm actually very enthusiastic and I love the exhibition. My question to the whole group on the table is about what's the communication strategy. One thing I've learned from communicating the concept of being ripped off is speaking in a language that most of the people understand. And I think it's really important, John, that Labour Party manifesto actually has stuff, a bit like this image here, that explains to the ordinary working person just how much a rip-off. And then just on the DLO concept, I can say from my experience, we stopped our manual workers being outsourced last year, and I'm really pleased, and I believe the potential of working people doing the work for those private companies could easily be done if they are motivated to do it under public ownership. I don't believe that would be a difficulty. But the key to everything today, to me, is communicating to the electorate. They understand the concept of being mugged and being ripped off, and I'd volunteer to help with anything that does to help improve communication. Thank you.
I don't think it was entirely irrational to go for PFI. In my youth, I was supervising student teachers in schools, and you'd get to the top floor, and the rainwater would be dripping through the roof, and it would be in buckets. So there was a real need and an impetus to do something about the appalling state of public buildings after 15 years of Tory neglect. If you're then told it's the only show in town, you either live with the water pouring through the ceiling, or you go for it, I think. So I think understanding the social context in which decisions are made is really important. Otherwise, we might do the same again.
Yes, the first question on Kent County Council, yes, that was to you.
Okay,
John.
what you're saying is we need to change the legislation. That's what we'll be doing. That's what we'll be doing. And that's what I said early on. For all the policies now, we're working up in detail the implementation manual and getting to the stage where we get draft legislation on the shelf ready to run. There's also another exercise we're doing, which is looking at regulation overall, and that includes the regulation of the accountancy firms and the audit firms as well, to see where we go from there. Because at the moment that we have a welter of different bodies that are involved in regulation, limited coordination, and some professional bodies that are self-regulators rather than anything else. So there's a whole exercise that we're undertaking at the moment. Some of the regulation work that's been undertaken is by Professor Prem Seeker, and his corporate abuse group that he brought together, that we worked with over the last 10 years. And so as we go into government, hopefully we'll have most of those options on the shelf, drafted legislation ready to go. With regard to the issue around, it's a good example around the snow, though. I think it's a good, I'll use that in future, especially when it snows. On the Proton, I'm not sure how it's been funded, but if it isn't a PFI and it's not private funding, it will have to be some form of CapEx, which is capital expenditure direct from central government via the NHS. But again, ask questions about it, see where it's come from. Our programmes will be around capital expenditure directly by government departments. We won't be going to private finance initiatives at all, or PPBs. We won't sign any of those whatsoever.
Is this anti-PFI then?
Sorry?
Is this anti-PFI?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know the detail of it. But if they're not going down the PFI route, it's PFI 2 now that the Tories are pushing. They must have got it either from mainstream funding in some form, if they haven't got it from private sector money.
It's a partnership with Proton International.
Is it? Well, there you are. It is a deal. So it is a private deal. It's a very similar.
Out,
yeah.
But I presume it's a PPP.
Yeah, so it most probably is.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, and on all of these, what's been really interesting is the way in which people have put forward. They've sought information, and as a result of that, people have been able to expose the detail of what's been going on in their area, because a lot of this is buried under report after report after report, which again, Freedom of Information Act applications sometimes have arrived at the detail of it, which has been really helpful, and the researchers have been able to put together. Can I just say, John Burgess is one of my heroes. In Barnet, he's worked for year after year, mobilising his Unison branch, bringing in the community, campaigning against Barnet Council and the madcap schemes that they have around privatisation. And sometimes with little support, sometimes from different hierarchies, John's soldiered on and done an immense task in exposing what's happening. And he's right in terms of the way we go forward now is how we communicate these policies, but also communicate the scandal that is PFI. What we want to do from the Labour Party's point of view is for every policy that we're advocating, we want to try and mobilise individual campaigns around those policies and bring them together. And so what we're trying to look at over the coming year in particular is where, I just take water for an example. We want to bring water back into public ownership because it's been a scandal, £18 billion worth of dividends paid out to shareholders, price has gone up 40% above the inflationary rate, etc., and poor services and used for money laundering into tax havens as well. So we want to look at how we bring people together around campaigning around water, demand it, a bit of direct action linked to that as well, and then translating that into a popular policy demand. On all of these areas on public ownership, it's interesting. If you take water, electricity, rail, if the opinion polls now are anything between 60 to 80% in favour of bringing them back into public ownership. And what's interesting, if you look at, I think you mentioned it, if you look at the surveys across Europe now, there's about 870 odd schemes right the way across Europe where public authorities are bringing the privatised public services back into the public ownership. In Paris, they've brought water back and operating extremely successful. And obviously, we'll be looking at the models that they use. But John's right, it's how you communicate that in a popular way, in a clear way, and I think these exhibitions are key to all of that. This issue about irrational, I think the reason I use the word irrational, it's irrational from the point of view of a government minister trying to achieve their objectives most efficiently and most effectively, most cost effectively. This was never ever going to be a rational decision. This was based upon political motives of, as I said, partly keeping some of these funds off the accountancy books, but also, I have to say, because neoliberal ideas had permeated even deep into some elements of the Labour Party as well. What we're able to do now is, as a result of people's concrete experience of PFI and other schemes, is undermine that confidence that they had in these neoliberal policy solutions, and as a result of that pose an alternative, and that alternative is around the concepts of public ownership, democratic control of our economy, etc., workers' rights, etc., wrapped up into, I think, the concept of socialism at the end of the day. But you're right, individual councillors and individual members on trusts, etc., were told this was the only way you'd get any improvement. This is the only way you'd get repairs to your school or hospital or whatever. That will never be the case under a Jeremy Corbyn government.
Yeah, just on the irrational thing, I do have some sympathy. I talked to a Labour MP who I won't name at Labour Party conference and said, you know, what do you think? Aren't you ashamed that Labour really rolled out PFI? And he said, and I think maybe this represents some of the Labour Party at the time, but obviously not everybody, because a lot of people were really awed by the neoliberal view. But he said, we thought we only had one term. We just wanted to build as many hospitals and schools as possible. And I can sort of feel a bit more sympathy for that. I still think it was an irrational decision, because you're still paying twice as much for a hospital as you would down the other way. But I can maybe see how that feeling of you've just got this one chance of 3 years to do as much as you can might have motivated some people to support it. Obviously, I still think it was definitely wrong and irrational. I think the comms point is so important, and it's really, really difficult. We've spent with various allies quite a lot of time brainstorming like what different ways to call PPPs and PFI, and have got absolutely nowhere with it. We took a PFI campaign to Glastonbury Festival, and we had lots of volunteers dressed up as cockroaches, which attracted people's attention. But then as soon as you mention the words private finance initiative, people's eyes glaze over. I think we either have to do what Greenpeace did with rainforests. So in the campaigning world, there's a myth. I'm not sure if it's actually true or not, that until Greenpeace invented the term rainforest, before that, there was a very technical way of describing the forest, which lives in the regions where there's lots of rain. And Greenpeace came up with the term rainforest as a way to communicate to people that. And I think we either need to do that with PFI, we just need to come up with a completely alternative name, which really sums up the rip-off nature, or we just need to actually avoid the whole discussion of the technicalities and make a positive case for democratic public ownership and public for services, and say we're wasting taxpayers' money on private profits, we need to stop doing that and just bypass all the technical aspects of it.
When I was talking about, this is in response to John, when I was talking about DLOs, I was talking about the construction industry. I'm talking about repairs and maintenance DLOs, which were fundamental, going back a way to, before even before Thatcher in the 1970s, etc. So I was talking very specifically about them, and I think there is a problem around just having DLOs for repairs and maintenance. And that's been shown by other authorities where they've built a construction capability as well. And I think we have to really look at that whole repairs and maintenance model. And particularly in a case where local authorities have been selling off public housing, that has massive things. You're selling off, declining an asset, and you're trying to build a DLO to keep them all in good repair. I mean, it's a hiding to nowhere. So I think we have to do that. In terms of other DLOs, or in-house services, as I prefer to call them, whether it's around waste, whether it's around corporate services, IT, street scene, etc., then we have to start a debate about how we're going to actually manage those, how we're actually going to structure them in the way that John's already said about in terms of democratic accountability, funding, and so on. And it seems to me that going back to what I said in the first place about the current capabilities and capacity of public sector bodies, then we have to, in a sense, start looking at it in a different way. We have to look at it in a much more imaginative way with much clearer vision, and to actually sort out how we do, what form of public ownership and control do we want, how that links into democratic control, how that links into service users being involved, and how it involves staff and trade unions being involved on a permanent basis, not on odd times. And I fundamentally believe that those kind of that user involvement, democratic control, trade union involvement, and staff involvement are actually preconditions. You've got to have those if we're going to have any kind of real public services. They're the building blocks. If we don't have those, then we might as well give up. We start with those, and we build visions about different kinds of organisations, and which won't be the same model everywhere, but there is scope for imagination, there is scope for experimentation. But we have to start that whole agenda because we haven't got a lot of time.
Yeah.
I've got 3 more questions. I think we've probably got time for one more. So first I'll take the woman.
I'm Terry-Day from Waltham Forest Save Our NHS and from Walthamstow CLP. And it's a question to John. I'm wondering if you can perhaps just assist me in some of the arguments we're having in Walthamstow CLP, because our MP has been the promoter of this idea of the windfall tax, which, I mean, I completely agree with Dexter, is kind of an irrelevance in a way, and it certainly doesn't do anything to end PFI. But in promoting that idea, 2 things have been said. One is, in fact, that the Labour leadership is now supporting the idea of the windfall tax. And the second is that there are legal arguments against, I think she even quoted human rights law, about case law around the difficulties of nationalising the SPVs. And I'm just wondering if John could comment on that to assist me in the arguments we're having.
Stephen?
Right. First of all, there was a bullying, as has been explained, into PFIs and ordering into PFIs. What that ordering has done has changed the nature of the order, the rank, i.e. it's contributed to increasing the wealth differential. It's actually increased the agglomeration of capital. So you get piles and piles and piles of money in the hands of big corporations, and in between you have troughs of the little companies, the SMEs, who have no power to get anything. So we need to, so what you explained, which I think was very interesting, was we need to reorder through a debullying process to change the nature of the order. And when I use the word order, I mean it in both senses of the word. Because order, of course, is about commanding. In other words, I'm the boss, or somebody's the boss. But it's also about who has most, who has less, who has least. So for that very reason, in the Latin language, the ordinarius means the foot soldier. It's not the imperator. It's not the person who holds power and dishes out power and controls. Right. The second point, right, is that we need to crack the code of all these detestable acronyms which don't help anybody. DLO, don't use it unless you explain what it is, but you shouldn't even use it.
PFI, PPP. They're all the bloody same. They're all monsters with the same face, with the same footprint, and it's a very dirty footprint. And it's not, it's incredibly serious because those acronyms, what they do, they create a mystery, an arcane mystery, which is impenetrable by ordinary people. If we dish out these acronyms to ordinary people, they'll walk away. So don't use acronyms. We have to change that. Finally, on the private-public, on the issue, what's going on there is public means it's everyone's. It's the people's. Private means it's mine and it's not yours. So, essentially, socialism, brilliant, fantastic, absolutely. Public. When we turn it into the publics, we're taking it out of the rich, dominant people's corporates' hands.
And if you be very brief, last question here.
Well, in 1980, when privatisation was underway under Thatcher, the economist John Kay published a booklet called Does Privatisation Work? And his findings were that there are two factors. One is whether quality and efficiency are improved by being private or public, and he found that it didn't make any difference to quality and efficiency. But the other consideration, that is competition, he thought that competition did make a difference and could drive quality and efficiency. Now that we have had so much privatisation, surely the same argument should apply in us promoting powerful direct labour organisations, because that's the way to discipline the private sector now, isn't it? To introduce competition with them from the public sector. And we have in the UK a great example of a DLO which is very competitive. The name of that DLO is the NHS, to introduce two acronyms. But the NHS is the most successful health service in the world, and it's a DLO. It's the biggest employer in the world. It's probably it's the fifth biggest employer in the world. It's probably the biggest DLO outside China. And it has worked. So I think it would be great to really have a mixed economy and let the public sector show its mettle, and this is the way that you discipline the private sector, by having real competition with it from the public sector and not the phony competition of the trusts and so on, and the cosy arrangements that go on between private companies.
Competition costs money.
Okay, shall we respond to those? Let's deal with the Walthamstow debate. All right. Let's be absolutely clear. Labour's policy is to bring the PFIs back into public ownership. The reason we've rejected the windfall tax is that it is a one-off hit, but you're still with the long-term debt and the long-term consequences of it. That's the reason. And that debate took place before last year's Labour Party conference. Within this place, in terms of how we are developing the manifesto on, and we made it absolutely clear that when we were in the finance bill a few weeks ago, Stella Creasy moved a windfall tax, and we supported it on the basis of let the Tories introduce a windfall tax because we could do it the money now. But we made it clear that when we go into power, we will immediately introduce the PFIs, bring them back in. Okay. Needless to say, the Tories did not introduce a windfall tax, but there you are. So that was the only time we muted it. But we've made it, and as Dexter said, we've made it absolutely clear in everything we've said that it isn't the option we will go for, because it's not the most effective way of ensuring either that we tackle the issues of the heavy debt burden and cost that there is, and at the same time it leaves these schemes in private control still. So it doesn't impact upon the root of the problem itself. In terms of the potential threats and legal problems, of course, I think, of course, there'll be challenges to whatever policy we put forward. So that's why it's important for us in this period before we go into government. That's why we're working through the implementation proposals. That's why we're looking at draft legislation on the shelf. And that's why we have a fairly good group of legal advisors making sure that we can second guess the potential of a legal challenge. But remember, Parliament is sovereign. Parliament will introduce legislation, and Parliament will also be the determiner of the price of any price we have to pay to bring these services back into public ownership. And I just say, for those who are saying this can't be done, exactly as I just said earlier, look around the rest of the world at the moment. Look around the rest of Europe. This is happening on a regular basis as people are coming to the conclusion that privatisation is not the way forward. It's been a rip-off in many instances. In terms of the issues around acronyms, I agree. We won't be saying that the NIB is going to use the advice of the NAO to tackle the issue of PFIs and to replace that with DLOs in consultation with the TUs. We'll try and avoid that. Okay. Although I'm sure on film there's me saying that at some point in time. But it is a real issue that we've got to address, and it's the point that John Burgess makes, how we communicate on all of that. This issue around bullying is quite important as well, and what we've got to do is in our public procurement practices make sure that we're ensuring that there is the point you're making, almost fair competition as well, because what's been happening through this process is almost like cartels have been formed, unofficial cartels. Big contracts are awarded, and then the small contractor, it's all this traditional sweating of the assets, isn't it? You introduce a mechanism that you're forcing down price to maximise profits, and then eventually that has an implication for the working conditions of those workers, their wages, as well as actually the delivery of quality services itself. And that's why I think the issue around John Kay's thing on quality and efficiency, look at the National Audit Office report. It actually says there's no evidence to demonstrate that privatisation in these forms, or in PFIs, PPPs, or whatever, delivers quality and efficiency more than direct service delivery. It just says that. That's not us saying, it's the National Audit Office. But I agree, there will be opportunities in the future whereby the public sector provision of a service will compete against private sector delivery, and that's inevitable, I think. And in the past, that has taken place anyway, but it's only since the 79 onwards, where public bodies have been constrained from entering into particular services. What we've said, for example, for local government, we want them to have the general power to be able to go out there and provide the services that they identify in their community, whatever that service may be. They shouldn't be constrained in any way, and that we'll be supporting them in doing it. And as I say, the competition element of it as well. If you look at the privatisations that have taken place, there is no competition. There's no competition on your local railway service. There's one company on a franchise, and that's it. And when those franchises go bust, as we've seen on the East Coast Line or in Connex, they get taken back into the public sector, they're run efficiently, then they've been reprivatised again. And the East Coast Line has gone through that twice. There's no competition in water. You can't look at another water provision within your particular area on a competitive basis, and it's the same in all that. These are natural monopolies. And they've used those natural monopolies to exploit that monopoly to rip us all off. We're going to end that. That will end under Labour government.
I'm just going to mention one final acronym to end on, which is ISDS or ISDR, Investor State Dispute Resolution Systems, I think. Settlements, which are effectively secret courts which are above national sovereignty, where multinational investors and companies can sue governments for governments introducing or changing laws which impact the profits of those companies. Now, fortunately, the UK isn't subject to any of these secret courts at the moment. Obviously, with Brexit, we're going to be renegotiating a whole new series of trade and investment deals. If, in order to pursue this agenda of ending PFI and protecting and enhancing public sector, public democratic control over public services, we need to keep an eye out, a very strong and clear eye out, to make sure that we don't get signed up to any of these secret courts, because there's lots of examples of governments losing these cases in the ICS courts. For example, governments that have nationalised or renationalised infrastructure, or have changed rules on things in the public interest. So we just need to be really, really careful of that as well.
Okay. Quality, efficiency, competition. I remember John Kay's book very vaguely, but not being arrogant, but I've spent 40 years researching privatisation and marketisation as well. And in terms of those three issues, quality does not improve through privatisation. There is a vast, vast body of evidence that shows, whether it's schools in Britain, charter schools in America, train services, and so on. I won't repeat what John's already said. Water, the whole lot. There is no real concrete evidence to show that through privatisation, quality of services actually improves. The second, and also related to that, of course, that nobody talks about, is the quality of employment, which we know that that is one of the big fallouts and one of the consequences of privatisation. And that's where we're now, if you look at the whole structure of the labour sector in terms of employment, both in the public and private sector, a lot of the roots of that are to do with privatisation and the neoliberal attitudes to people in work, and in terms of how they should be rewarded or not rewarded, or whether they should have a pension or no pension, and so on. The next issue about efficiency. I'm no fan of the IMF, but I will use them when I quote them. The IMF did a study that goes back about 2004, I think, and they concluded that there was no real difference between the public and private sectors in terms of efficiency. And efficiency is this thing that's peddled out so much. It's peddled out in Barnet. I mean, Barnet are faced with this. But for in local authorities like Barnet, they equate efficiency with cheapness. If they get it cheaper, they think, oh, that's good, it's more efficient, because they were paying less money for it. But I mean, that is just utter nonsense. And so, the evidence on efficiency is not there. And in terms of competition, the private sector is working to abolish competition. They don't want competition with somebody. Carillion didn't want competition with Costain and Skanska for Norway. They wanted all them out of the way. They wanted just to be handed the contracts. And if you look at that even at the local level, at the smaller level in terms of contracts. So competition doesn't actually drive quality or efficiency. And I think that one of the most fundamental things we could do when we're talking about different kinds of local authorities or whatever, is to get rid of commissioning. Commissioning is the driver of competition. Competition of certain kinds is going to be inevitable in a mixed economy. But the idea that we should structure the public sector dividing the client from the provider of those services and let them all fight it out and force the provider to act like a contractor is hiding to nowhere. So that seems to me that we have to accept that there are forms of competition, but that we should not structure local government or any public sector around the idea of commissioning, and therefore we then minimise the role of procurement, and then we get to a position where, like the NHS operates, education used to operate, you do the service, you deliver the service. You don't have to go out to tender. Why should we go? Why are we obsessed with procurement? I'll stop there.
Thank you to Dexter, to John and Sarah for their contributions tonight. Big thank you again to Helen and to Marion for putting together the photo exhibition. If you'd like to book the exhibition, there's flyers going around at the back of the room with details on how to contact both the campaign and Helen to book a screening of the exhibit in a location near you. Please grab one. And again, we've got copies of the booklet on the back table. Please grab yourself one and make a donation. And finally, thank you to you all for coming out tonight. Thank you.